So a lot of detail here that is, we must look at all of it as necessary. None of it as superfluous or unnecessary or what we could have done without all of this narrative. We've well made historic claims that we believe this Bible to be the Word of God, and we believe that every piece of it is for our good. And we make proclamation. We are the kind of people who believe this Bible. We believe this book. We believe that God has spoken in such a way for our benefit. And so there will be some things that maybe don't draw as much attention for us, but we'll look at it as the whole. This is a beautiful encounter of a man sent by his master Abraham to do what his master has instructed him to do. And so, thus it is. Verses 1 through 9 is the instructions that Abraham's servant will receive from Abraham. We get some details. We already know that Abraham is old. Well, the scripture here is going to tell us he's not only old, he's advanced old. I don't know what that means, other than he must really be old. It's estimated at this point, Abraham is about 140 years age. Yeah, that's not only old, that's advanced old. That's older than anyone in this room has ever met somebody old. And it's the age I don't think any of you are hoping to live to. Unless, I always say, unless I can do so without losing all dignity in life. May the Lord. Nobody lives to 140 anymore. Bless the Lord. Amen. Well, I expected at least some of the advanced in age to say amen to some of that. But none of you are near 140, are you? You think you're old. No. Oh, no. You're not advanced old yet. But here he is, 140 years old. Now, we know this in comparison to the early chapters of the book of Genesis when men were living long years, some near to and as close to a millennia as anyone has ever lived. Can you imagine? You meet somebody who's near 100 years old and you have a quick moment of conversation with them and you learn they've seen a lot in their days, haven't they? They've witnessed a lot. They've experienced changes in nearly everything in life. But could you imagine living nearly a millennia? What kind of changes would you have observed? But here, Abraham, 140 years old, he's not out of capacity to do anything, but he's now going to send his messenger or his servant, his oldest servant, which, by the way, it's possible. He's not named here in Genesis 24. But we do pick up a name of Abraham's oldest servant back in Genesis chapter 15. This is where the first time Abraham receives word from God that God is going to bless Abraham and multiply his seed. And Abraham's perplexed at this. How is this possible? I don't even have a son. I mean, as it stands right now, all of my possessions are going to my servant Eliezer. And so he's named there, and he is the one who is in charge of Abraham's household. He's the one who is expected to receive the inheritance of Abraham should there not be an heir for him to pass along. So we can at least say it's most likely this Eliezer, if he's still living at this time. He would definitely be younger than Abraham, but if he is, and by the way, most of the scholarly world pins Eliezer as this elder servant, just primarily by the way that the text refers to him in the closeness and the kind of trust that Abraham trusts him with. Abraham's already willing to trust everything into his hands in chapter 15, and here he is entrusting Eliezer, or this servant, with that next step of the advancement of the seed of Abraham that will go through those born to the house of Abraham and Sarah. So Abraham instructs his servant to go to his family. So he's going to go to Abraham's family, who are still living, as we see the general area here is referred to as Mesopotamia. This would be probably the first place that Abraham journeys out of whenever he leaves his father. So out of Ur of the Chaldeans, Abraham journeys into the Mesopotamia, and there Abraham journeys further away from the rest of his family. And we learned in previous chapters that Nahor, Abraham's brother, sets up camp in this Mesopotamian area. And so Abraham's instructing his servant, go back to my family, go back to that place. And this would be, again, some knowledge that this servant knows where he came from, is even familiar with the journey. This Eliezer that we learn of in chapter 15 is from Damascus, which is in the Mesopotamian area, a little bit further to the east of where Abraham will journey on further west and south. So he sends him back to what he would expect to be a familiar region where Abraham's expecting his family is still present, still living, still prospering, still doing business here. So he sends him back there. And in his sending, there's still some details that we pull out of verses 1 through 9. We see that Abraham insists that he goes to his brother's household to find a wife for his son Isaac. His first concern is that Isaac not marry a Canaanite. Now this is sticky in a day like today. But whenever we understand the concern that Abraham has about the Canaanites, it makes sense that Abraham does not want his son to marry idol worshipers. This would be those who are making up the residents of the land of Canaan. They have given themselves unto the plethora of idols that have begun to increase. Almost as many gods as there is human population. Abraham does not want his son to be crippled with a wife who is given herself to idolatry. Now, we can stop and make a couple of observations here. It is a glorious thing when the gospel reaches into the lands of the pagans and the idolaters, and that conversion, true conversion, comes out of that. Abraham would not be opposed to this. Abraham would love for his son to be married to one who worships the one true living God. And it is possible. Matter of fact, we know that this is the purpose of what God will intend with the gospel, is to send it to all the nations. We know that even in Genesis chapter 15, when we hear of Abraham's discourse with God about how am I to do this when I don't have any offspring, that Abraham was well aware that the gospel will not just be for his physical seed, but this will be for a blessing to all the nations, even the Canaanites. But for a wife for Abraham, this is not, as some would want to make an argument, this is not an argument for racism, that Abraham is opposed to someone marrying someone who's not of their nationality or of their family. This is not that. This is primarily the issue of whose God are the women worshiping in this land where Abraham is a sojourner. Abraham is well traveled. Abraham is well known. Abraham knows about the people of the Canaanites. They are idolaters. So he insists to his messenger, my son must not marry an idol worshiper, a Canaanite. So this is really a spiritual issue. And he also instructs him, do not take Isaac with you. We're going to make an oath in a really peculiar way, and we're just going to acknowledge the peculiarness of it, and we're just going to move right along. It is an intimate oath between Abraham and his servant, where he's instructed. Abraham instructs his servant to place his hand under his thigh and promise that he will not that he will not let Isaac marry a Canaanite, that he will travel to his brother's homeland, and that he will not take Isaac with him. Well, they do so. They make a covenant. This, where it's a peculiar step in the covenant process. It is not all that uncommon at all at this particular time in the customs of where Abraham is living and the practice in which they are practicing. So the servant does so. He places his hand under Abraham's thigh and promises, I will not let your son marry a Canaanite. I will not take Isaac with me, and I will go to the home of your brother to get a wife for your son. So a covenant is made. Now we can see here, this is a covenant that has a sunset clause in it. So in other words, it's a covenant that's not Abraham's servant is not bound to it for life. He's bound to it for a season. So this is why the covenant process is different than a cut covenant that God makes with Abraham. There's no blood sacrifices. This is a lesser negotiated covenant that has a sunset clause in it. A sunset clause meaning that, hey, if you go and do everything that I've commanded you to do, and you still do not find a wife suitable for my son, then you've not broke the covenant. The covenant is null and void. So it's a covenant that has a deadline on it, or a loophole. I don't know. I'm shooting from the hip at the moment. It's not even in my notes. This is not a loophole in it. It is one that says, if it doesn't work out like this, I won't charge you if you don't fulfill what I've sent you to do. Well, verses 10 through 14, we see a couple of other things. Abraham's servant does travel to Nahor. We also learn here some details that Abraham sends his servant off with 10 camels and a handful of treasures. What do you do about that? 10 camels. So look to all the men in the room. Think, did you trade any camels for your wife? Again, we're going to talk about a different culture, a different day, and this is not unusual. That Abraham is expecting his servant to find a prize wife. I know it even sounds peculiar coming off my lips in this Western context, but this is not at all the way the modern mind would think about this. This is actually to the glory of God. Now, we can think. I wonder if well, I'm certain of this. Every man in this room thinks of his wife as a 10-camel wife, in the best sense of that. She's worth it all, right? She's worth a great dowry. She is not only is she worth 10 camels, she's also worth some gold rings and some bracelets and great treasures. Right? Your wife is. And my wife is. I'm married to a 10-camel wife. I know right now she's looking at me saying, why did you say that out loud? And I'm sitting here talking to myself. I don't know why I'm still talking about this. So I'm hoping for lunch later. She is a 10-camel wife. She's worth treasures of this world. This is how the Bible speaks about what a wife is to a husband. She is a treasure. Well, I don't know, at your next anniversary, I don't know how well this will go over if you go purchase 10 camels and say, happy anniversary. I love you, babe. I don't know what we're going to do about those 10 camels, but I want you to know I love you. Well, so here we go. Abraham's wife, in verses 10 through 14, he does travel. He takes the treasures with him from Abraham's treasury. He goes and he's done something really quite beautiful here. He has knelt down outside the city at the well. Make note of this. Wells are significant places in the Old Testament. They're significant places in the New Testament because they tell the ancient story of God's people. And so here's another moment where an encounter amongst the household of God is going to take place at a well, a place where water is drawn from. Keep all this in mind. Never take off your gospel ears when you're reading the Old Testament. Never unhitch your wagon from this glorious Old Testament narrative of the gospel. Because in the New Testament, Jesus is this living water. Think of those moments when Jesus met people at wells. He met one in particular at a well in a particular region where there was great strife between Jews and the Samaritans. These other individuals who are at strife with each other. And there's a glorious gospel moment taking place. And what does Jesus do? But He relates to the water, the temporary quenching of thirst, to the eternal quenching of your spiritual thirst found in Christ. So there, keep those gospel radars clicking at all times, looking for, hearing the sound of the gospel throughout all of this. And this is one of those moments. He's stopped outside the city. He's at the well. And there he's knelt down to pray. And he's praying to God on behalf of his master Abraham. He says in verse 12, grant me, he's speaking to God, grant me success today and show loving kindness to my master Abraham. It's a beautiful prayer, actually, and one that when we stop and make some practical applications about the precepts or the principles that are in this text, it's one of the places I'm going to want to stop and highlight the significance of how important it is that you're praying actively, and that it is not inappropriate for you to pray for success in the work of what you're doing for the glory of God. And then in verses 15 through 27, we see that Rebekah is the one who's brought to the top of the servant's attention. And this as answer to the servant's prayer, and this in compliance or in agreement with Abraham's command to him to go to the house of his brother. Through the providential hand of God, the servant of Abraham will have this encounter with the daughter of Abraham's brother at the well. It is quite stunningly beautiful that this kind of success to the narrative, or the success to the intention of the journey that is brought out through the narrative here, that we would see this. And I think God is being kind to us. He's being kind to us to see that there is an instruction given by the patriarch Abraham, and he gives it to his faithful servant, and his faithful servant goes and does exactly as his master sent him to do, and the servant does not go outside of the providential instructions of God. He's praying to Abraham's God. I think that that's just a beautiful way that the narrative is expressing this. I don't have any reason to believe that that the servant is not a worshiper of the same God of Abraham. But his showing respect through the narrative here, as he's praying to Abraham's God, he's believing in the God he's praying to. It's a good argument here that we would also see back several chapters ago when Abraham's instructed to circumcise not only his own offspring, but also all of his male servants, all of those who are in his enterprise, all those who would be associated with Abraham, are bearing the mark of the people who belong to Abraham, who belongs to God. So there is this, I call this a kind providence of God to let us see that kind of detail in what would otherwise just be filler if we're just talking about a backstory, or we're talking about parts of a narrative that are not significant in the primary plot of the whole of the narrative. But God's letting us see some beautiful things in this. And we'll see more, Lord willing, when we journey through verses 28 and following. But let's do this. Let's get a little bit let's hunt for. I don't think we have to hunt hard, but let's peel out of here some important principles that can be applied to our lives. First of all, I'm going to primarily be speaking to fathers and mothers here in relationship to your children and the importance of those whom one day your children will marry. I'm not making a case for what has been declared or been called prearranged marriages. I don't think that that's even what this is. I think this is providentially what God's doing through instructions, and that when they're followed closely, it might look like, hey, there's Isaac and Rebekah had no choice in this matter. I'm not making a case for exclusively prearranged marriages without the consideration of the children. I don't think that this is not a principle or a precept I would peel out of this. What I would peel out of this is the intentionality of the parent. We know at this point from the narrative that Sarah has already passed away, but this would have been in compliance. Abraham and Sarah would have been one on this. They don't want their son being married to an idol worshiper. They want their son to be married to one who is a worshiper of the one true God. And so, where the attention will be in the application, it will seem as though it's more applied to the parents of children here. I think that all of us can certainly appreciate and even make some connections that are not explicitly laid out here in the text. But let's clarify. I think it's important that the clarification of your actions to those who are near you. Now, I'll borrow this from Genesis 23, the death of Sarah. Abraham has a communicated plan about the care of the body of his beloved wife. And he's clarifying these actions to those that are near him. He's clarifying it to his household. He's clarifying it even to the residents in the region. There's beautiful things that happen there in chapter 23. It's happening even still here. Abraham has been very clear about his intentions for the kind of woman that his son needs to have to be this first step. This will be the second step of the first results of the promise that God gives to Abraham and Sarah. This is going to be critical. Those who come out of the house of Isaac will be those who will advance the promise of what God gives to them. Now, I'll stop here for just a moment. You don't need me to remind you that we're not far from a lot of dysfunction in this family. So there's undoubtedly dysfunction in humanity. Husbands and wives, we got so much to uncover, and I don't want you missing any times of reading through this narrative or sitting through and participating in the exhortation out of this text, because there's going to be beautiful things and there's going to be things that are going to really make you, how is it possible that the advancement of the seed of Abraham can at all possibly come to any good end? The only possible way for that to happen will be for the kindness of God. And we're going to watch a lot, we're going to hear a lot of dysfunction. We're going to hear dysfunction inside of this household eventually. But now, on the front end, it's all quite romantic. It's all quite stunningly beautiful. But what we're looking at here is Abraham has clarified his actions to those that are close to him. his family, his servants, his household knows that Abraham does not want his son marrying a Canaanite, an idol worshiper. So what can we draw from that? For you and me, I mean, you ought to avoid idolatry at all cost. All right? Moms and dads especially hear this from me. This world is bent on capturing your children's attention to bow down to their gods. If you're not aware of that, today it is my prayer this morning, my prayer this week, would be that you would begin to realize the dangers that your children are in by the kinds of idolatry you're giving them access to. Be extremely careful. You cannot keep your children from going down sinful, wicked ways. But you ought to do all within God's power and strength and instruction in your life to avoid, if it's possible to avoid it completely. I don't know that it's possible. But you ought to take intentional steps to avoid idolatry, the traps of idolatry for your children. The entertainment you subject them to, the education you subject them to, the influence you subject them to, all of these. Avoid idolatry, if at all possible, at all cost. With care, with understanding, with consideration, you cannot. But don't welcome it into your home. Don't display it by your own idolatry. It's a trap that snags your children. You must be careful. Abraham is extremely clear here. Eliezer, do not let my son marry an idolater. Do not take him with you, because God has promised that He will give me this land. And if you take him there, the most likeliness is he's never coming back to take possession of the land that God has promised me. So he's clear about his instructions. And I would say also, because this is one of the attributes we've learned about Abraham along the way. Abraham is also very loving. He's very kind. But he's very clear, isn't he? A third thing that I would want to say to the parents here in the room is you should intentionally be putting the kind of people you want to marry your children around your children. I've rewritten that sentence 4 or 5 times, and I'm still not sure I've clarified the intention of what I'm trying to say. Put your children around the kind of people you wouldn't mind your children being married to. Okay? I think that's about as... I should have written that down. Be very careful about this. Again, you go to thinking that listen, the end of how my children end, we're just going to trust it to providence. Well, you're not doing anything that anyone else isn't doing. We're all trusting everything to providence. But why be foolish and let affections be given to your children with people you don't want your children marrying? Be extremely careful in this. Now, though some of you have very young little boys and girls, and you're thinking, listen, preacher, I got nothing to worry about. I got a long time to get this figured out. You can, and so this will be only by the grace of God. That if you keep your children around the kind of people you want your children to marry, it'll be the grace of God that they marry a God-fearing, God-worshiping soul. And you can say, oh, I'm just going to throw caution to the wind, and I'm just going to trust that my children are going to meet other God-worshiping people, non-idolaters. And listen, it will be only by the grace of God that happens. You and I are not arguing, and we're not far off of what we're saying. But I'm saying here, let's follow the example of our patriarch Abraham, who's going to do everything that leads to success for who will marry his son Isaac. It just makes logical, helpful, trusting confidence in the Lord. Now, again, I've already spoken about this does not mean there won't be dysfunction in that household. We're just a couple of page turns in the Bible, and we're not far from heavy dysfunction. And we're never away from the gospel. And we're never away from the grace of God. But another thing that I would want to encourage your faithfulness in, and that is prayer. Now, yes, what's recorded here is the prayer of a servant of Abraham. But Abraham's servant isn't praying like this unless Abraham's servant is not under a master who is a praying man. We already know this. Abraham's relationship with God is as intimate of any relationship mankind has ever had. Abraham prays, his servant prays. And so it should not surprise us when he arrives at the well outside of the city of Nahor, named after Abraham's brother, Nahor. That when he's there, he kneels down, he even kneels down his camels. And what do they do? But he prays. And he asks God for success. Abraham nor Abraham's servant are not willing to just trust this to chance. They're trusting in the grace of God, yes. But they're not going to throw caution to the wind and just say, whatever comes, comes. And if they marry unequally, then it must have been God's providence for that to happen. Well, we can get into deep philosophy here. Yes, that is true. But why not participate actively in the providence of God? For your own blessedness and for your own children's blessedness. Now, when I'm saying parents here, I hope you're hearing grandparents, great-grandparents. I think you've got as much skin in the game here as others. Parents and grandparents alike. Praying for the spouses of these little boys and girls that God has blessed households with in this church. Listen, every Sunday when I invite these boys and girls to the front to sit down with me for a few moments, can I exhort you as parents to be praying that God will give a spouse to your son or to your daughter? Perhaps it'll be from among those that they're sitting with right over here. Perhaps it will be others that you give influence to your children. To the whole of the congregation, I say, this is a moment where we can pray in agreement with each other that we would ask God to give success to marriages that will glorify God in this place. So to the parents, don't miss the opportunity to be praying for your children. I'm not saying that's the only time you can pray for that success, or that's the only place that God will give success to that prayer. But I am saying, isn't it a glorious opportunity that we have, that when the boys and girls are coming to the front, that we're all praying, asking God to give success to their marriages. I appeal to you. Pray with me like that. Pray for your sons and daughters like that. Pray for each other's sons and daughters like this. Now, it's possible. Dear church, I don't say this as a hope or to somehow strike out to be some crazy prophet who would say things that nobody wants, but it's very possible that some of these unions of the boys and girls in our church will walk through great dysfunction. It's possible, isn't it? One of the first reasons it's possible is because they're living through your own dysfunction. But it's possible they'll face hardships, even when married to people that you want marrying your children. And so what we'll have to be doing as well is praying for grace from God, mercy from God. And so, praying, parents and grandparents praying for the spouses of these children. Everyone in this church praying for these precious little boys and girls. Unless there is and this will be a rare exception, that one, perhaps maybe two of these boys and girls will never get married. You must understand how That will be the exceptionally rare occasion. The normal is they will get married. And will it matter to you at all who they marry? I know it will matter to you. I know it's important to you. Pray now, beginning in your homes, in your prayer closets, and at the church house, praying that God would give success to these kinds of marriages that will honor God and glorify Him. Churches praying for these children. So not only families, but churches. Have you stopped to really even consider what kind of spouse do you want for your children? Are you going to be the kind of parent that says, well, just good luck with that, and I hope it works out in the end for you? Or do you have any occasion to give influence upon your children about what kind of spouse they ought to be looking for? What would be the attributes or the characteristics of the one that your spouse, that your children would marry, that would be their spouse? Ask God for this kind of success. So we have a case study that's in front of us. So one of the things that you do with a case study is you look closely at some of the details. What do we learn about this Rebekah in this text? She's an exceptional woman. First of all, the Scripture describes her as a beautiful woman. Now, verse 16, your translation is giving the implication that she is a child, or that she is she's a young girl. Remember, we've already made some arguments that whenever the Bible uses this in its original language of this, that gets moved over into our English translation, sometimes it gets a little sticky and complex. When you're 140 years old and the daughter that your son is going, or the woman that your son is going to marry is 30-ish, you can call her a girl. Or if you're in the narrative telling of this, you can say, we saw this with Abraham concerning Isaac. We see this with Joshua, Moses, in reference to him as a lad. So this kind of language, this is not, some in this culture would like to say this is disgusting that an old guy, so if Abraham is 140 years old, that's got to tell you something about the age of Isaac. Right on the threshold of 40 years old. And what is the business does he have marrying a girl, a beautiful virgin? Well, again, the way the narrative is from the vantage point of the one telling the story. Rebekah is a grandchild of Abraham's brother. So she will be somewhat the same age. Some in the scholarly world even arguing maybe even, if not the same age, perhaps even older than Isaac. Now, I don't want to get lost in the detail and lost in the argument of who's older or what. It's just of interest. You know, Abraham is an old man whenever God gives him Isaac. Well, back in Mesopotamia, Nahor has a whole slew of children, grandchildren. Most of them not even listed in the descendants of Nahor. So the possibility. Have you ever been in some families where aunts and uncles are younger than the cousins? So it's possible inside of this. And so in the family tree of things, we can conclude they're most likely within the same age. The text doesn't give us great detail, so we're not going to lose ourselves in it, but we're going to at least acknowledge here, this is not a little 6-year-old girl. It's not a 12-year-old girl. Best case scenarios, this is probably a 30 to 40-year-old woman who is still a virgin and has never been given to a man in marriage. Isaac, approximately 40 years old. A first encounter with the one who will be Isaac's wife. The narrative here tells us some beautiful things. Rebekah is an exceptionally kind woman. She's hospitable. So these are attributes, I would say, to the parents in the room. You should be instructing your children, look for these attributes, look for these characteristics in the one you will marry. You as a parent ought to be looking for these kind of characteristics and attributes amongst those who have influence, who could potentially someday marry your children. Rebekah is a truthful woman. Rebekah is a generous woman. Rebekah knows how to anticipate the needs of those around her. In this prayer of the servant of Abraham, he's got this elaborate dialogue of how it's all going to come out. And I don't think he even gets finished in one sentence before Rebekah is anticipating his very next step, his next need. I say, this is an attribute. Moms and dads, help teach your children to observe those who know how to anticipate needs, which is a kind action. This is a hospitable action. This is an individual behaving generously and kind, truthful. Ask God for this kind of success. Now, I think there's more we can peel out, and we will. Lord willing, when we get to the second half of chapter 24, we'll peel out some more attributes of Rebekah that I think are worth observing and adding to a list of characteristics and those things that you ought to be teaching especially teaching your sons, look for these kind of attributes in a woman that you would marry. It doesn't mean these aren't attributes that a man shouldn't have, and that you can't teach your daughters, look for these attributes in the boys that they will one day marry. In the boy, singular, that they will one day marry. So may the Lord give occasion to you to stir you into action this morning, into actively participating in the success that God would bring to your household. Fathers especially, listen closely here. You have much influence here. It doesn't mean that the women in the room don't have the opportunity or the influence to help their sons and daughters in looking for the proper attributes that they would have in their spouses. But fathers especially, note this, these little boys and girls are given to your household for you to lead, right? Are you not to lead your households? You will lead. You will either lead passively, which is dangerous leading, or you will lead directly and intentionally. And understanding this, that even in your leading intentionally, there still could be heartache down the road. So we're not looking for a path of least resistance that causes the least amount of pain. What we're looking for here is how can we glorify God in what we're doing right now. So households, so fathers and mothers, pray for your little ones. Grandmas and grandpas, pray for those precious little boys and girls you love to spoil. Church family, pray, pray, and pray. Ask God for success. And may God bless the nation with households, a multiplying households who love God, who are not mixed with idolatry and love for the world, but love God and God alone. May God be glorified as you pursue and as you aim to raise these kinds of boys and girls. May God give success to the camp today.